It is my great pleasure to introduce Thomas to you today. Thomas is a genuinely warm and accessible person. He was born in the Bronx and grew up there and in Kingston, Jamaica. He's a graduate of Bowdoin College and Brown University in the USA. Thomas traveled as a Fulbright scholar to Jamaica, where he studied Jamaican historiography and Caribbean intellectual and literary traditions. While in Jamaica, Thomas worked on issues of social justice and helped found the Jamaica Forum for Lesbians, All Sexuals, and Gays, acronym JFLAG. It was on one of his visits to Jamaica in 1998, at the launch of JFLAG, that I had the pleasure to meet Thomas. I was then the head of the UWI-Mona campus Center for Gender and Development Studies. He is always generous with his time and knowledge and willingly agreed then to teach a course in a module I was then offering at UWI-Mona entitled Sex, Gender, and Society, where we look at the themes of alternative sexualities. If any of you know Jamaica, that was in fact a daring move on both Thomas's and my part to offer that on the Jamaica campus. Typically, Thomas reprised this generosity of spirit and participated in a course I'm co-teaching this semester at St. Augustine during this week when he was here. The course is Cinema and Gender. And the students were absolutely delighted to have him. He engaged them in a very wholesome and worthwhile discussion on the films which we are viewing this week on sexuality. Thomas is a prolific and well-recognized author, the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, including an O. Henry Prize for Fiction and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Fine Arts, and this Fine Arts Center in Provincetown, and he was named a writer on the Verge by the Village Voice in 2000. For those of you who know the O. Henry Prize, that is a very prestigious prize to have won. His essay collection, Words to Our Now, Imagination and Dissent, was nominated for a 2006 Publishing Triangle Gay Men's Nonfiction Award and winner of a 2005 Lambda Literary Award. His fiction collection, Whose Song and Other Stories, was nominated by the American Library Association for the Best Gay Lesbian Book of the Year award, and by the Quality Paperback Book Club for their Violent Quill Best New Gay Lesbian Fiction Award. His newest book of fiction, The Torturer's Wife, released in the fall of 2008, was a 2008 Lambda Literary Award finalist. Thomas obviously doesn't write a book without it beginning. It's already beginning to start collecting awards. In that same year, he did win a Lambda Literary Award in the same 2008 for the anthology we launched today, Our Caribbean, a gathering of lesbian and gay writing from the Antilles. He was a 2008-2009 Martin Luther King Jr. visiting professor in program in writing and humanistic studies at MIT. And at present, he's a professor of English at the State University of New York at Binghamton. Apart from his biographical links and affinities with Jamaica, Thomas has traveled widely in the Caribbean, to St. Lucia, Barbados, Martinique, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, San Andres, and Providencia. This is his first visit to Trinidad, and from what he says, apart from other things, he is enjoying it. As a writer, and as we celebrate his work today, I was interested in presenting him to you more than the standard biographical fare we academics turn out. What has contributed to making Thomas the writer he is? He's a reader and thinker who longs to see particular stories told that had not been told, so he went about writing them himself. His writing is suffused with the activist hat he also wears. The connection between writing and activism is not always clear, but it is precisely this unclarity and the constantly unfolding questions and injustices that keep writers and scholars and activists so committed. As Thomas says, I can't always know, but I would like to think that the activism keeps me in touch with real human pain and suffering, and adds a political reality and edge to my work that I hope also helps to make me a more conscientious global citizen. Like all writers, he has a love affair with language itself that propels his work. Such is his fascination with language and writing that in the short biography that he sends out by email attachment, he carefully explains in parentheses that, quote, and this is not normal in a biography that one would send out, Bowdoin, the first university from which he graduated, rhymes with slowed in or growed in accent on first syllable. Thomas says he can't imagine a world without books and stories. At the day's end, he says, books make me happiest, more than just about anything else, I think. He's equally appreciative of other writers. He likes to enter another writer's world and be transported into their world, their story. But he says he also wants his language to work as lyrically and evocatively as possible. I like to think of it, he says, as a texture that my language possesses. Thomas, we welcome you to the UWI St. Augustine campus, celebrate your work with you, and look forward to learning from your textual and textural explorations. Thank you.
Big warm thanks to everybody, to Pat Mohammed for that magnificent introduction and the warm greetings, you know. And to Pia Pangsapa, to all the people who have made this visit possible, and to Colin Robinson and to Lawrence Scott for being here tonight to be able to share in the anthology, because it's really a thrill to be able to work and share with the actual contributors in the book live, and two Trinidadians at that, who are actually here in Trinidad and have been here for some time. So I'm really, really appreciative, and I have to say that I've felt extremely welcomed, and people have just bent over backwards. And if this is any example of Trini hospitality, then it's just phenomenal, and I really want to thank you for it, and thank you for coming tonight to share in what I think is hopefully the joy of the book itself. So I thought that what I would do is read from a few selections in the anthology, since we have two other people reading as well. So these will be fairly brief, and to give you some sense of what is actually in the book in terms of texts and writers and so on. There are actually 37 writers in the book from 14 different Caribbean nations, and they span a variety of languages, and all of which have been translated for the purposes of this book into English. And quite a few Trinidadians in the book. And the project itself, I talked about in the introduction, I said to a few classes here at UWI, took about 5.5 years, I think, from the initial conception to the actual ending, to the actual publication of the book. Trying very hard to reach people across the Caribbean in all sorts of locations to try to get as broad a perspective and variety of people as possible, who were not only necessarily known as writers already, but people who also were involved in activism and in community organizing and lived in places that might not have been as visible to someone looking for writers for a project like this. And I remain very, very grateful to all the writers who worked so hard to make this book happen and to come together, because it was a project that was indeed, from the very beginning, very demanding, and I think I didn't realize how impossible it was until I realized how possible it was, you know? So, all right, so, and that's really the truth. So what I'll do first is I'm going to read from Reinaldo Arenas, who is from Cuba, who died in 1987, was born in 1943 and died in 1987 of HIV, and was a Marielito, left Cuba during the Mariel boat lift, and was very outspoken in Cuba. He's very well known to some audiences today because of the film that was made from his memoir, Before Night Falls. Although that film, as interesting as it is, does not really follow the text very accurately in some ways. So there are many discrepancies. But this actually is from his memoir, Before Night Falls, this little section that I'm going to read. And it takes place in Cuba, as you'll hear, and details some of what he experienced during his time there and then up until just before he left. So this is first from Reinaldo Arenas. He writes, "Men would go to the beach with their wives and sit on the sand to relax, but sometimes they would go to the changing booths, have erotic adventures with other young men, and then return to their wives. I remember a particularly good-looking man playing with his son and wife in the sand. He would lie down, lift his legs, and I could see his beautiful testicles. I watched him playing with his son for a long time, lifting his legs and showing me his testicles. Finally, he went to the changing booth building, took a shower, and went up to get dressed. I followed him. I think I asked him for a cigarette or a match, and he invited me in. For 5 minutes, he was unfaithful to his wife in the most astonishing way. Yes, and later, I saw him again with his wife on his arm and his son, a beautiful family picture. I think that image prompted the idea for my novel, The Sea Once Again, published in the US as Farewell to the Sea. Because the sea really provided us with the greatest sexual excitement, that tropical sea full of extraordinary young men who swam either in the nude or in bikinis. To be by the ocean and look at the sea was always a wonderful feast. We knew that somewhere in those waves, an anonymous lover would be waiting. In addition to the pickups during the day, which generally took place at the beaches, there was another powerful homosexual scene in Havana, underground but very visible. There were pickups at night all over La Rampa, at Copelia, on Prado Boulevard, and along the Malecon Shore Drive, and at Coney Island in Marianao. These areas were full of recruits and students, single men who were locked up in barracks or schools and went out at night eager for sex. They were willing to settle for the first thing that came along. I always tried to be one of the first they met in these places. Hundreds of them ended up in my room. Sometimes they did not want to go that far, in which case we had to risk going downtown to Old Havana, where we would walk up some stairway to the top floor and lower our pants. I think that in Cuba, there was never more fucking going on than in those years, the decade of the 60s, which was precisely when all the new laws against homosexuals came into being, when the persecution started and concentration camps were opened, when the sexual act became taboo, while the new man was being proclaimed and masculinity exalted. Exalted, yes, exalted. And we saw many of the young men marching in Revolutionary Square, applauding Fidel Castro, and many of the soldiers who marched, rifle in hand and with martial expressions, came to our rooms after the parades to cuddle up naked and show their real selves, sometimes revealing a tenderness and true enjoyment such as I have not been able to find again anywhere else in the world. Perhaps deep down, they realized they were breaking into the realm of the forbidden, the dangerous, and the damned. Perhaps that is the reason why, when that moment came, they showed such fullness, such radiance, and enjoyed every instant in the awareness that it might be their last, that it could cost them many years in jail. There was, moreover, no prostitution. It was pleasure for pleasure's sake, the craving of one body for another, the need to find fulfillment. Sexual pleasure between two men was a conspiracy, something that happened in the shadows or in plain daylight, but always forbidden. A look, a wink, a gesture, a sign was enough to start the sequence that resulted in such full enjoyment. The adventure in itself, even if fulfillment did not come with the desired body, was already a pleasure, a mystery, a surprise. To enter a movie theater was to figure out whom we would sit next to, and whether that young man over there would stretch out his leg toward us. To reach over slowly with one hand and touch his thigh, and then to dare a little more and feel the part of his pants where that penis wanted to break through the fabric. To masturbate him right there and then, during an old American movie, to see how he would ejaculate, and then leave before the movie ended. And perhaps I would never see him again, after having seen his face only in profile. What does it matter? He was surely a wonderful guy. People would get sexually aroused on interstate trips. If you took one of those buses crowded with young men, you could be sure that some erotic games would take place during the trip. The driver would turn out the lights, and the bus would be moving on those highways full of potholes. With each lurch of the vehicle, one had the opportunity for contact, for touching an erect penis, a young thigh, a strong chest. Hands could move over a body, feel for the waist, unbuckle the belt, and then, cautious and eager, reach for the spot where that terrific member lay hidden. Those adventures, and the people with whom one had them, were great. Those men enjoyed their roles of active males. They wanted to be sucked and even to fuck right on the bus. Okay, that's Reinaldo Arenas. I'm going to read now from a piece by Audre Lorde that is extremely unknown and unseen, and I was very, very happy that I was able to find it and use it in this anthology. And this piece was written toward the end, quite close to the end of her life, and it's titled Of Generators and Survival, Hugo Letter, and of course it documents the Hurricane Hugo that devastated the Virgin Islands and St. Croix, pardon me, and other parts of the Caribbean when she was living there. And I'm just going to read the last couple of pages of the essay. And what I found very interesting about this piece, and I said this in the introduction to the book, is that this is one of the very few essays, or any writing at all actually, by Audre Lorde, in which she never names herself as a black lesbian feminist or a black lesbian feminist warrior mother poet, or discusses those details, those politics in that way in this piece. She rather discusses the geopolitical and colonial relationship between the U.S. and St. Croix. But what I was fascinated by at the same time, and I said this in the introduction as well, is that in spite of the fact that she does not name herself as she has done in the past, she's still moving her black, lesbian, female body to do all these things that she's doing. So it's very much center stage nonetheless. So I thought this was a very interesting piece just to look at for lots of reasons, obviously, but also because it's so unseen. And I don't know if any of you have ever actually seen this piece before, but even there's a recent release of Audre Lorde's Uncollected Works, and this essay is not in that book, right? So you'll find it here and maybe in one publication that came out in St. Croix many years ago that's not very easy to find. So this is from Of Generators and Survival, Hugo Letter. And it's from the late middle to the end. She writes, "There is a prevailing and insistent language of the generators that we all began to learn. No matter what else is going on, in the midst of every conversation, one ear is always attuned to the coughs and spits that might mean the generator is struggling or missing or about to run out of gas. Quick, quick, throw the switch before it stalls, or else it will be twice as hard to get started again. And then, of course, since they were never meant to be run constantly, the overworked generators soon begin to fail. The frantic quest begins to find someone with the expertise and time to repair your generator, not to mention trying to locate necessary but unavailable parts. Quite quickly, an influx of mainland workers, more and less qualified, begins. Some are hired by state-aided private companies at wages 30% higher than local workers earn during the same job. Some of these new arrivals are skilled and dedicated workers who lend a genuine helping hand in rebuilding. Others acquire a hammer and a bag of nails and become construction workers, snapped up by new and indiscriminate contractors. Brash and noisy, eternal beer cans in hand, these construction crews are often the lately unemployed of depressed southern mainland cities, continental roustabouts seeking any opportunity who float from disaster area to disaster area. Nakedly disregarding local culture, their social impact is unavoidable. There is an enormous amount of work and restoration to be done. Qualified builders in other Caribbean islands cannot help us rebuild because of immigration and work permit quotas, but anyone with proof of American citizenship can call herself or himself a contractor. Construction companies spring up overnight and vanish as quickly. Even some local contractors take on more work than they can handle, promising what they cannot deliver, and disappearing for weeks on end. Complaints about shoddy work and dishonored contracts sprout like guinea grass across the island. The nights are hardest. Even though the mangled landscapes are less visible after dark, there is more time to think and feel the true impact of this experience, to cry and to marvel at all our varied powers of survival in the face of disaster. I try to write in my journal as often as I can before weariness overtakes me. I'm sitting at my desk by a flickering glass lamp from Mexico with a bowl of rose-colored lamp oil that sheds a warm light. A warm breeze blows from the sea. At any other time, it would be quite an idyllic scene. Now, I could give it all up in a minute. 12 weeks and many crises in other parts of the world later, and we still do not have electrical power, telephones, rapid communication, a permanent roof, or glass in our boarded-up windows. But we do have a gas stove brought to us by Curtis from out of his own kitchen, and a temporary roof and a larger generator that runs the refrigerator lent to us by Mary Mingus, and some lamps and a water pump. The island is green again. The sun is more brilliant than ever. We see spectacular sunsets, and even the flowers are returning, covering over the mangled, broken trees in the rainforest, and the mounds of twisted galvanized, heaped alongside every roadway, waiting for the Army Corps of Engineers to come haul it away. We are rebuilding, more wisely if we can, those of us who claim this island as home, with determination and will, as well as courage and style. For those of us who live in the Caribbean, hurricanes are natural occurrences that we must be prepared to experience, as we experience the beauty and other benefits of living in this region. But we must also learn to live in such a way that the effects of these natural events are minimized, and the after effects of such occurrences are absorbed by realistic pre-planning that includes all members of our society. When the next hurricane season comes, will there still be unfortunate people displaced by Yugo, still living under blue temporary tarpaulins that are decaying from overlong use in our tropical sun? We are a territory of the most powerful country on earth, supposed to be. Why are there almost 700 families still homeless? If we do not learn the lessons of Hurricane Yugo, we are doomed to repeat them, because Yugo will not be the last hurricane in this area. Our earth is healing herself again, and we pay a price for the violence we have done to her in the name of scientific progress. I am determined to pay my part of that price here in the best way I can. In West Africa, the Voodoons say it is at the crossroads that we must leave our problems for other travelers to find and seek solution. I do not want to indulge in magical thinking as an excuse for avoiding action, but I do know that hurricanes are a way of cooling off the earth, and I also know that we are burning down the rainforests, polluting the atmosphere, and heating up the oceans and the earth, not to speak of tearing jagged holes in her protective ozone layer. The earth is telling us something about our conduct of living, as well as about our abuse of this covenant we live upon. Not one of us can believe himself or herself untouched by these messages, no matter where she or he lives, no matter under what illusion of safety or uninvolvement we may pretend to hide. Each one of us has some power that can be used, somewhere, somehow, to help save our earth. And the next time you think choosing a rub-on deodorant instead of an aerosol is the only thing you can do to make a difference, just feel what kind of ecological violence it does to hurl 40 tons of revolving plutonium up into the sky over our heads and call it scientific progress, which is what the USA has just done in our name, with our money. And remember Hurricane Yugo. My friend, I wish you were living down the road. Rocky as it may be, it is still also the most beautiful. Gloria and I would take our walking sticks after a long day's work, and the 3 little bluefish Curtis just brought by, and go clean them down on the beach, throwing the guts to the seabirds. We'd bring the fish over to your house, and all sit around and have a fish fry over driftwood coals, swapping stories of how it was, and how it is, and how it is surely going to be. May 1st, 1990, St. Croix, U.S. Virgin Islands. It's nice to hear you clapping for Audrey. I'm just going to read 2 more things from the book and then step down so that the other people can read. Briefly, I'm going to read from Makeda Silvera's piece, Makeda Silvera from Jamaica, and from her essay, Man, Royals, and Sodomites, some thoughts on the invisibility of Afro-Caribbean lesbians. And then I'm just going to read from my introduction and close up shop. And yes, right, okay. Many of you might be aware of this essay by Makeda Silvera. It's a classic. I was really, really happy that I could include it in the book. for all the importance that it continues to give us information about these lost stories, you know? So you know that, I'm sure, if you don't know, man royal is one of the Jamaican terms, the degrading terms for lesbian. And royal means half in Jamaica, so man royal is like half man, like Chinese royal, Indian royal, man royal. And sodomite, obviously, is another degrading term for lesbians taken directly from the Bible, but not indicating lesbians in the Bible, but sodomite as in those nasty, disgusting people, the sodomites. Okay, so this is Makeda's, part of Makeda's essay. All right. The veranda. My grandmother sat on the veranda in the evenings after all the chores were done to read the newspaper. People, mostly women, gathered there to discuss life. Life covered every conceivable topic: economic, local, political, social, and sexual. The high price of saltfish, the scarcity of flour, the nice piece of yellow yam bought at Coronation Market, Mr. Lamb, the shopkeeper who was taking liberty with Miss Inez, the fights women had with their menfolk, suspicions of Miss Iris and Punzi carrying on something between them, the cost of school books. My grandmother usually had lots of advice to pass on to the women on the veranda, all grounded in the Bible. Granny believed in Jesus, in good and evil, and in repentance. She was also a practical and sociable woman. Her faith didn't interfere with her perception of what it meant to be a poor black woman. Neither did it interfere with our Friday night visits to my Aunt Marie's bar. I remember sitting outside on the piazza with my grandmother, 2 grandaunts, and 3 or 4 of their women friends. I liked their flashy smiles, and I was fascinated by their independence, their ease, and their laughter. I loved their names: Cherry Rose, Blossom, Jonesy, Poinsettia, Ivory, Pearl, Iris, Bloom, Dahlia, Babes. Whenever the conversation came around to some big woman talk, who was sleeping with whom or whose daughter just got fallen, I was sent off to get a glass of water for an adult or a bottle of cola champagne. Every Friday night, I drank as much as half a dozen bottles of cola champagne, but I still managed to hear snippets of words, tail ends of conversations about women together. In Jamaica, the words used to describe many of these women would be man royal and or sodomite. Dread words, so dread that women dare not use these words to name themselves. They were names given to women by men to describe aspects of our lives that men neither understood nor approved. I heard sodomite whispered a lot during my primary school years, and tales of women secretly having sex, joining at the genitals, and being taken to the hospital to be cut apart were told in the schoolyard. Invariably, one of the women would die. Every 5 to 10 years, the same story would surface. At times, it would even be published in the newspapers. Such stories always generated much talking and speculation, from, "Boy, them kind of girl nasty, sir," to some wise old woman saying, "But this can't happen. After all, 2 shot pan can't join," meaning identical objects cannot go into the other. The act of loving someone of the same sex was sinful, abnormal, something to hide. Even today, it isn't unusual or uncommon to be asked, "So how do 2 women do it? What will you use for a penis? Who is the man and who is the woman?" It's inconceivable that women can have intimate relationships that are whole, that are not lacking because of the absence of a man. It's assumed that women in such relationships must be imitating men. The word sodomite, of course, derives from the Old Testament. Its common use to describe lesbians or any strong, independent woman is peculiar to Jamaica, a culture historically and strongly grounded in the Bible. Although Christian values have dominated the world, their effect in slave colonies is particular. Our foreparents gained access to literacy through the Bible when they were indoctrinated by missionaries. It provided powerful and ancient stories of strength, endurance, and hope, which reflected their own fight against oppression. This book has been so powerful that it continues to bind our lives with its racism and misogyny. Thus, the importance the Bible plays in Afro-Caribbean culture must be recognized in order to understand the historical and political context for the invisibility of lesbians. The wrath of God rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 19:24. How could a Caribbean woman claimed the name. And when, Bible in hand, my grandmother responded to my love by sitting me down at the age of 27 to quote Genesis, it was within the context of this tradition, this politic. When she pointed out that, quote, this was a white people thing, or, quote, a thing only people with mixed blood was involved in, to explain or include my love with a woman of mixed blood, it was a strong denial of many ordinary black working-class women she knew. It was finally through my conversations with my grandmother, my mother, and my mother's friend 5 years later that I began to realize the scope of this denial, which was intended to dissuade and protect me. She knew too well that any woman who took a woman lover was attempting to walk on fire, entering a no man's land. I began to see how commonplace the act of loving women really was, particularly in working class communities. I realized, too, just how heavily shame and silence weighed down this act. She writes, a conversation with a friend of my mother. Well, when I was growing up, we didn't hear much about woman and woman. They weren't suspect. There was much more talk about Batman business when I was a teenager in the 1950s. I remember one story about a man who was suspect, and that every night when he was coming home, a group of guys used to lay wait for him and stone him so viciously that he had to run for his life. Them time, he was safe only in the day. Now, with women, nobody really suspected. I grew up in the country, and I grew up seeing women holding hands, hugging up, sleeping together in one bed, and there was no question. Some of this was based purely on emotional friendship, but I also knew of cases where the women were dealing, but no one really suspected. Close people around knew, of course, but not everyone. It wasn't a thing that you would go out and broadcast. It would be something just between the two of them. Also, one important thing is that the women who were involved carried on with life just the same. No big political statements were made. These women still went to church, still got baptized, still went on pilgrimage, and I'm thinking about one particular woman named Aunt Vi, a very strong woman, strong-willed in everything. They used to call her Man Royal behind her back, but no one ever dared to meddle with her. Things are different now in Jamaica. Now all you have to do is not respond to a man's call to you, and them call you a sodomite or a lesbian. I guess it was different back then, 40 years ago, because it was harder for anybody to really conceive of two women sleeping together and being sexual. But I do remember when you were suspect, people would talk about you. You were definitely classed as different, not normal, a bit of a crazy. But women never really got stoned like the men. What I remember is that if you were a single woman alone, or two single women living together, and a few people suspected this, and when I say a few people, I mean like a few guys, sometimes other crimes were committed against the women, some very violent, some very subtle. Battery was common, especially in Kingston. A group of men would suspect a woman or have it out for her because she was a sodomite or because she acted man royal, and so the men would organize and gang rape whichever woman was suspect. Sometimes it was reported in the newspapers, other times it was not. But when you live in a little community, you don't need a newspaper to tell you what's going on. You know by word of mouth, and those stories were frequent. Sometimes you also knew the men who did the battery. Other subtle forms of this was scorning the women, meaning that you didn't eat anything from them, especially a cooked meal. It was almost as if those accused of being man royal or a sodomite could contaminate. In bed that night, I thought about these women. I cried for them and for me. I cried for that woman in particular I remembered from that time. Miss Jones, her name was. My grandmother had told me about her. Miss Jones, a mannish-looking Indian woman with flashy gold teeth, a Craven A cigarette always between them. She was always nice to me as a child. She had the sweetest, juiciest Julie, Bombay, and East Indian mangoes on the street. She always gave me mangoes over the fence. I remember the dogs in her yard and the sign on her gate, beware of bad dogs. I never went into her house, although I was always curious. I vaguely remember her pants, her shirts, although I never thought anything of them until my grandmother pointed them out. Neither did I recall that dreaded word being used to describe her, although everyone on the street knew everything about her. Thank you to Makeda. Thank you. And I'm just going to finish with a few paragraphs from the introduction. quickly that well, I guess you'll hear what they talk about, as I just read them here. Let's see. Oh, yeah, okay. All right, just the very beginning. The introduction is titled Desire Through the Archipelago. Okay. Okay. As a child of Jamaican immigrants to the United States, and one who regularly spent extended time with family in Jamaica, I couldn't know how much, over the accumulating years, a book like this would someday mean to me. It is both fair and accurate to say that this anthology, this gathering, as it is titled, which makes its own contribution to an ever-increasing conversation, is a book that I and others have been waiting for and have wanted for all our lives. It is in no way an exaggeration to say that this gathering originated as an idea born out of the most extreme longing, the desire to know finally and with complete certainty that a book such as this one actually existed and could exist in spite of thundering condemnations from Christian fundamentalist ministers and others, could exist, a book like this that, although some might wish to ignore it or dismiss it, none would ultimately be able to deny or wish away. Numerous writers whose work I have long admired have consistently expressed a sentiment similar to the one that motivated this collection, also centered in desire. They wrote the books they did, they said, because they wished deeply to read them, texts that up until the moment of that writer's yearning had not yet been written. Those writers wanted to know that the stories they committed to paper actually existed, could exist for the passing along, for the next watchful, waiting eye. I wouldn't be truthful if I didn't admit that this gathering also owes its genesis to the most painful, inexpressible loneliness, one that, as the years passed me from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, grew increasingly agonizing, made more so by the sorts of intransigent silences I hope the voices in these pages will unsettle. That loneliness stretched through every hour of the silent and silenced wondering one couldn't possibly dare, when young, to ever express out loud to anyone else, or perhaps most dangerously, most terrifyingly, to oneself. Wondering, could there somewhere out there be others like me, wherever out there was? Wherever out there was, I knew it to be a place beyond the supposed safety of family, which was not always so safe. A place where I was despised, even hated, by those who ranted that hatred publicly and shouted it joyously in church. Were there others in Jamaica and other parts of the Caribbean who also pondered unspeakable thoughts and thought in the depths of their own silences unmentionable things? Were there others who colluded with that silence and its creeping shadows? Shadows that, like that heavily weighted silence, invariably led to rage, to self-loathing, to desperation. Some of us, myself included, thought those things. Some of us, in spite of those thoughts, did not leave the Caribbean and will not leave it still. Although some opted to stay, many had, and continue to have, no choice. Green cards are not always easy to secure, nor are visas for those who need them most. And families often are in need of help. The desire for home, often abides in the traveler. Our history, perhaps especially the history we find most intolerable to remember, the one that began for some of us with harsh voyages across the sea, but never ended there, is about nothing if not movement, memory, displacement. This book began, crept to its knees, and shakily, then more assuredly, began to walk through all of that and more. Walking, though slowly, and increasingly aware of its flesh taking shape, the book began to ask questions, pester even. Through all the hours of its more groggy, wobbly-kneed state, it wanted to know the same things I did, things about the people like me, whom I longed so much to know, and who it seemed were so often impossible to find in Jamaica, Martinique, St. Lucia, Trinidad. People whose eyes would say something recognizable, friendly even, in the Dominican Republic, St. Martin, and Guyane Française. People out there who also gazed across that water that simultaneously divided and united us all, and who dreamed, yearned their way through those emotions and all that desire. Women for women, men for men, women and men for women, men. That erotic, emotional desire for people of our own gender that it seemed no one, not anyone at all, ever spoke about, much less wished to hear about, unless in the realm of scandal and disgrace. Those people, yes, the people of out there, and as I would later learn, nearer, but where did they live and how did they dream? Who, through love and desire, loneliness and pleasure, were we hoping to be, imagining ourselves to be, and becoming through our many Antilles? Our Antilles of Creole and English, Creole and French and Spanish, Papiamentu, Dutch. Our many Caribbeans of cricket and baseball, soccer and football, and carnival, juve, crop over. Our islands and memories of zonas coloniales, ciudades viejas, a very well-known soufrière and basse-terre, grande-terre, all traversed by mountains, rivers, ghosts, diablesses, duppies, sucuyans, jumbies, and more. And all of our music, zouk, salsa, rara, bouillon, reggae, rumba, calypso, ska, ton, son, tumba, begin, bomba, dancehall, soca, merengue, and still so much more. What would it be like to attend, to truly hear for once the many conversations that we have had with each other and still need so very much to have? What would it be like to listen to, and now, by way of a gathering of voices like this one, actually observe these conversations between ourselves? What would it be like to bear witness to the conversations between Mati, women loving women in Suriname, and their distant sisters and brothers in St. Eustatius, Saba, and Bonaire? But then close your eyes, a certain tree tells you, in order to hear better the words of those two. Two women together, or two men, or two women men, or men women. They are in Haiti, yes, in Jérémie this time. There, in that near darkness, overlooking the sighing shoals and what remains of the ever-entangled mangroves, they are holding each other, those two. Holding, caressing each other's most secret parts, and whispering things into each other's neck, things, the tree says, that their brethren and sistren in Fort-de-France, Marie-Galante, and even all the way over in Cayenne, Guyane, would like to hear. We too would like to hear it, the tree tells us. It is, in its own old way, one of us, that tree. It always has been. We would like to hear all of it for the expansion of our imaginations and our very lives, our survival. It is so very important for us each to know that we are not, no matter what anyone tells us, throughout the archipelago and beyond it, alone. And so, finally, it is a great pleasure to present this book to readers. Readers everywhere, and I hope as many in the Caribbean and of Caribbean background as possible. For all of us, wherever we may be, and however we may ultimately decide to identify ourselves and pursue our lives, an ending of silence and invisibilities begins here. In the pages that follow, the conversations that began long ago in imagining and desire continue. For as you surely know, and as I have learned and still am learning, the coming together that is this one and others like it widens, deepens, and as far as I can see, has no end. No end, no end like the sea. That sea not far from which this all began. Its water still stretches a broad, restless belly out to the sky. Just now the sun meets it, gently wetting first its chin in those waves, then its wide brow. Palms flanking the shore murmur as seabirds dip, scolding but more weary at the day's end. Cane stalks rustle in the breeze, insects wither, and the evening's peepers commence their choral chants. The water continues to gaze calmly, as it has always enjoyed doing, at the light-speckled shorelines suddenly retreating beneath dusk's quiet step. Quite soon, the moon, lumbering up over those hills in the east, will have something to say about all this. But for now, over all that glistening water and beneath it, gathered voices are rising. Rising as they call now, as they call here, as they utter so softly, listen. Thank you.